our grand finalists. Thank you. Today we have the motion. The House believes that parent spanking of children should be a crime. And without further ado, I'd like to welcome the Prime Minister to the podium.
Ladies and gentlemen, Mr. and Madam Speakers, we the population side face a problem in the status quo. When parental spanking of children is something that is not uncommon in Korea, there's a problem in the status quo. Firstly, the immorality of violence that is caused toward the children. And secondly, on the point of the negative effects the parental spanking causes upon the children. Therefore, we propose the motion today. This House believes that parental spanking of children should be a crime. Now, in this population side, we have the stance that children, like any other human beings, should be free from the fear of domestic violence, ladies and gentlemen. And under the stance, we have to first define today's motion, provide the team split, and then move on to the first argument. Now, to define today's motion, we have to define this House as the Republic of Korea. As parental spanking as when a parent orders something as a punishment or takes active action to cause pain to the child for certain purposes, mostly for education. It includes both spanking with objects, such as with plastic rulers, or just
Ladies and gentlemen, we face team opposition that is willingly ready to justify violence for the name of education. But we say in team opposition that there is no way and there is no meaning of justifying violence, because whether or not the purpose is for education or the purpose is for the parents themselves or not, violence, we say, should be never justified in our society. Now going on to the specifics about what the last speaker has told us. Against our argument about how there is unjust violence inflicted upon these children, all they've stated is that because we're not talking about cases of abuse, we're going to allow spanking. Now, ladies and gentlemen, they basically avoided our argument, because our argument was not talking about cases of abuse, but we were talking about the general case of violence. We say whether it is abuse or not, we say violence should be never justified, because violence is taking away the bodily integrity of these children. We say in other cases as well, for example, when we're talking about torturing terrorists for the better good of the society, we say that just because there is a justifying reason that is for the citizens and for the better good does not mean that we can't justify violence. And we challenge team opposition. What is the standard of justifying violence or not? And secondly, we say that even though there is the law that says that abuse should not be allowed, we say that the standard is very vague and ambiguous. For example, many laws state that even shaking a child vigorously is abuse because it can cause serious mental problems and physical problems for the child. And there is no law code that states how much hitting or how much times you have to hit in order for that spanking to be abuse. And we say that all of these ambiguous lines and standards lead us to the fact that we can't really discover and we can't really distinguish what is abuse or not. And that's why we have zero tolerance policy, because we believe that every pain is subjective, and simply saying that because it didn't leave huge bruises on your hands is not an abuse, it's not right. Sir. We're going to not allow violence at all, ladies and gentlemen. Yes, sir.
You do believe that not having the right and abstract standard is not the right justification for the government to come in the way these parents teach their children?
Yes, we do understand that you might think that these are abstract standards, but the fact of the matter is that we can't simply measure pain, we can't simply measure spanking and violence by how much times you were hit and by what method were you hit. We say that all of these ambiguous standards should be considered and no violence should be justified at all. And their first argument was about how these parents have rights. They said these parents are responsible for their children. Now, we do agree that parents should be responsible, but the fact of the matter is, even though these parents have responsibility, there is a line that they cannot cross, which is violence. We say that even though we do admit that these parents do have a responsibility, if they harm the bodily integrity of these children and go against the general law, which is against violence, the government should intervene. No, thank you, sir. And their second point in this argument was about how this is very efficient. We said this is a very bad idea because saying that violence should be justifiable, that we can subject our children into fear of domestic violence simply because this is convenient for the parents is ridiculous, ladies and gentlemen. Now their second argument was how parents know the best and how every single child is different. Now we do understand that every single child is different, but this argument does not matter in today's debate because whether that child likes spanking or doesn't like spanking or whether spanking is effective to that child, it doesn't matter because in all cases, to all children, violence should never be justified. And we say that our stance stands strong that violence should never be justified, and these bodily integrity should not be taken without the permission of these children. Going on to our own argument about how this gives negative influence to children, we're going to talk about two harm states. First of all, how this makes them aggressive, and secondly, how this sends a wrong message. When spanking their children, emotions can be involved in many cases. And what happens is that these children start expressing that violence to other people in their daily lives. There have been numerous studies that prove this. In pediatrics, which is a book, university professors have studied 22,500 children and found out that those who were spanked more frequently at age 5 were much more likely to be aggressive by age 5. And there were other studies that showed that spanking leads to the aggressive behaviors of children. And we say this is a clear social harm and a harm to the children that cannot be accepted. And secondly, we say that this teaches them a wrong lesson that violence is justifiable when they're handling people who are younger and people who are weaker than them. We say that many students learn in the morning in the school that violence is never justified, and then they come back home in the evening and they see their parents start hitting themselves. We say that this is a contradiction by government, and the government should stand on one side that violence should be never justified. And the bigger problem is that these students grow up to be adults still with that notion and start using violence. We beg you to propose. Thank you.
Now I'd like to welcome the Deputy Leader of Opposition to the podium.
Ladies and gentlemen, we today are facing a proposition team telling us and characterizing our parents as an irresponsible and evil deeds, ladies and gentlemen. But is that the case, ladies and gentlemen? They have been characterizing as all of these parents using these parental spanking as an educational method as these irresponsible people that are using these violence as a means of convenience, not because they're trying to educate these people. Ladies and gentlemen, this is perfectly an exaggeration of the situation. Ladies and gentlemen, think back through our memories, ladies and gentlemen. Most of us has experienced parental spanking at least once through our lives. That doesn't necessarily mean that we suddenly become a violent and aggressive members of our society. Just because they told us about the statistics in which it states that the people who have the exposure to these violent parental spankings in early ages led to these aggressive behaviors doesn't necessarily mean that it was from these experiences that they lead to violence. There was significantly a lack of explanation why it was because of parental spanking that it led to the aggressiveness of these children when they grew up. And now that these are set, let me first of all move on to rebutting some of the points made by the proposition, and then move on to our elaborating on our last argument. They first of all told us about how these violences or these parental spankings should be regarded as unjust violences, and the acts of parental spanking is justifying it as an educational means. But we have constantly telling you the only reason they gave us why why it is unjust is because it is used under convenience of these parents, and also there is a constant possibilities of this use leading to abuse, ladies and gentlemen, because there is no standard for it. But ladies and gentlemen, we say there is clearly a standard for these abuses in the laws and regulations, because the law clearly states that in any cases when the child is through these parental spankings, when they are given these irreversible harms, these are regarded as abuses, and these are independently regarded as crimes. So we say there's no reason for us to integrate these parental spankings into the category of abuse, ladies and gentlemen. Also, we believe when they are arguing to us that there's no standard for deciding what is abuse and what is not, we say it is parents who are best to decide what is good for their children, because as we are telling you, it's not the government but the parents who knows best, who are regarded as the legal guardians, who are the most who knows what kind of method is best for these children. And we strongly tell you that in these cases, parents still have the responsibility and the right to choose for themselves, for their children. Also, we say that we have clearly told you about how bodily integrity is not the absolute right that we cannot infringe upon, because we do believe that bodily integrity might be important. But we have clearly told you many of these circumstances when more than bodily integrity, when stopping these child from doing certain action is in life or death situations, bodily integrity certainly comes after these issues. We say when the baby is crossing the street where cars are existing, we say a sudden a measure to stop the child, first of all, from doing that action is more important than regarding these bodily integrities and stopping these actions. We say that's why some cases parental spankings should be differently recognized from these abuses. Now let me move on to our last argument regarding the government intervention. In this our last argument, we're going to talk about the government intervention regarding the line of government intervention. Where should we draw the line in which the government can or cannot intervene in? The government of our society stands to protect our rights as long as we fulfill our responsibility. One of these integral rights citizens possess is issues regarding privacy and choices. These rights, no others, even the government, can intrude or infringe upon. The same situation occurs here, ladies and gentlemen. The government has no right to intervene in home issues, parent-child issues, especially when it is related to education of their own children. The society even accepts these parents as legal guardians and most responsible entity, even delegated some of the children's rights, ladies and gentlemen. We say the justification of opposition might be in cases of abuses the government should intervene. But in these cases, in the status quo, parents are already punished when their parental spankings goes over the line of abuse. Secondly, we say the opposition side believes that this is not enough justification for the government to intervene, since there's no reason the government can stop these parents from educating their own children, because we see these rights of these parents also standing not harmed by the bodily integrity they are proposing. We say such an illegitimate and unlawful intervention of government in home issues will be justified through the proposition's policy today. We're acknowledging governments as the rightful being to decide upon these personal and private issues happening within our homes. Such acknowledgement is going to provide a leeway for the government to intervene in future issues as well, regarding furthermore harming the sanctity of our own home issues. All in all, ladies and gentlemen, the admission of government's proposals isn't reckless to come to unjust forces, with future possibilities fully open for their abuses for justification. Therefore, we probably oppose. Thank you.
Now I'd like to welcome the government whip to the podium.
Ladies and gentlemen, and the most honorable adjudicators, the only beings in our society in the Republic of Korea that can be lawfully hit are the children, which are basically the weakest and the most vulnerable members of our society, ladies and gentlemen. We say that we face a serious problem in the status quo, that these children are open to violence domestically, and we say that the status quo needs to be changed, and we on the proposition side are basically willing for a change and we are proposing for a change under the stance that children, like any other human being, should be free from the fear of domestic violence. And with that stance, we would like to move on and look at the assumptions of team opposition and also move on to the clashes after on. Well, first of all, let's talk about the assumptions of team opposition today. Well, first of all, they've told us that they have a law of, in the status quo, they told us that they have a law that is basically regulating the abuse of parents against the children. Well, we say that this is also an assumption because we've already told you, Mr. and Madam Speakers, that pain is subjective. And the abuse, no, thank you, sir. And the abuse cannot be defined by the government because we say that how the children feels cannot be felt by the government and cannot be felt by the parents. No, thank you, sir. And therefore, abuse cannot be any kind of violence cannot be tolerated by the government. And also, they've told us that through spanking, teenagers and children will be able to understand things. Well, we say that this is also an assumption because we believe that teenagers actually a period where they actually where they're mischievous and when they feel emotions that makes them want to go against the parents. And we say that inflicting pain and especially physical pain upon these teenagers is definitely not effective and it's not going to help them get anywhere. And now I'd like to move on to my class. No, thank you, sir. First of all, about the parental limits of rights, and second, limits of parental rights, and secondly about the government's duty. Well, first of all, the parental rights and government's duty. The limitation of parental rights. Well, the opposition side told us, ladies and gentlemen, that parental rights exist, and therefore the rights should be delegated to the parents, and especially when the parents can have difficulty controlling the kids. Well, on the proposition side, ladies and gentlemen, we told you that it's the government's duty to protect the children to the furthest extent. Well, let's talk about, no, thank you, sir. We would like to talk about two major points in this class. Well, first of all, we say that there must be a limitation to parents' rights, even though they're the parents and even though they're the ones who actually gave birth to them. We believe that, no, thank you, sir. We believe that violence cannot be tolerated under any circumstances. We've already told you that violence itself is basically taking away bodily integrity of these children. And we've already told you, Mr. and Madam Speakers, that the action of violence and taking away the bodily integrity through the action of violence, no, thank you, sir, cannot be reversed because the children is already hit. And we say that especially under the circumstances when abuse cannot be clearly, when the definition of abuse is clearly very,
Sir.
no, thank you, sir. When the definition of abuse cannot be clearly defined, we say that zero tolerance policy stands in today's debate. And secondly, about the children's rights. We say that it's the government's duty to protect the children's rights to the fullest extent. Ladies and gentlemen, domestic violence, wait a moment, sir. We do not allow women to get hit domestically by law. But why do we allow children to be open up to the possibilities of domestic violence and hittings, ladies and gentlemen? Yes, sir.
Do you seriously think that the best way that the government can protect these children is to ban the best way of education that these parents choose?
We say definitely because we believe that there is no benefit coming from the violence inflicted by the parents in today's debate. And now that I've answered that POI, I would like to move on to the second clash regarding the point of government's duty. Well, the opposition side told us, ladies and gentlemen, that the government has a line that they should not cross because we're talking about private matters. On the other hand, the proposition told you, ladies and gentlemen, that the government's duty is to protect the children. Well, we believe that there is one very clear standard in which the government has a legitimate reason to cross into private matters. And we say that that line and that very clear line is violence, ladies and gentlemen. We say that because violence itself cannot be tolerated, we believe that the government's duty is to step in and actually stop the parents from inflicting any kind of physical pain to the children, regarding the fact of the matter that the pains caused to the children can definitely result in the consequences of children becoming more aggressive later on when they're actually in the society, ladies and gentlemen. We say that violence itself is bad, and that's the exact reason why we like to strongly propose today's motion under a stance that children, like any other human being in the world, also has the right to be free from any kind of domestic violence, and therefore we like to strongly propose. Thank you very much.
Now I'd like to welcome the opposition to the podium.
the status quo when the parents decide to spank the children. Not only because the side proposition today assumes and just concludes that it's violence. Let's look at the background. The spanking occurs because the parents concludes at the fact that there needs to be a physical pain and the damage to the child because there is a lesson that is more important just because there should be a punishment. And we say that the lesson is concluded by the parents who love their children the most and know the children the most. And we see the best actors to decide upon the children, the parents themselves. We see that the government today has no room for today intervening in the parents' rights to decide for their own children's benefit. And we see when the government especially is giving the responsibility of the children's actions and now restricting the education methods of the parents, we see that the contradiction coming from the side proposition. Now, the proposition's main assumption was mainly, first of all, was the fact that there is no punishment over the line of violence. But, ladies and gentlemen, they kept on telling us that the line of arbitrary line of abuse is today's issue. We tell you, yes, maybe as the side proposition argue that pain may be subjective. However, the result of the pain, what court considers as an evidence for abuse, is objective in the status quo. We see that the evidence what court decides according to the legal court today is absolute, therefore not arbitrary in the status quo being considered as fine. Now moving on to the clashes I found this debate. First of all is about the bodily integrity versus the parental rights. Second of all is about the government's role in the status quo. Third of all is about the future implications of today's side proposition's motion. Now moving on to the first clash is about the bodily integrity. They argued that the bodily integrity is something that is natural and cannot be taken away. First of all, just because it's natural right does not mean that that is absolute. For example, in the case of self-determination, goes to every human being. But in cases of minors, because we acknowledge the fact that they lack the cognitive ability to decide for themselves, we give the right for the parents to decide what the benefit of child will be. In cases of DNR, do not resuscitate. When the child has going through the life and death situation, the decision lies on the parents and legal guardians who can make the best decision for the child. We see in this case the bodily integrity does not lie on the children, but the parents themselves, which is show that the bodily integrity can be delegated to the parents when the parents see that the benefit children overweighs the bodily integrity in this case. Furthermore, we told you that the parental rights are already being restricted on cases of abuse. They say that just because violence is there, we're going to restrict it in zero ground. But we see the cases of abuse, we're clearly punishing them. Just because the parent make the children to lift the chair for 3 minutes, that does not mean that the government should intervene and say that your education method is wrong. And we see this leads to the second clash, which is about the government's role. Now the side proposition today argued about the protection. Why the vulnerable children should not be open to the violence. And they also told us the line is vague and the conflict of interest is here. Just because the conflict of interest does not mean the government can intervene in the status quo. We see that the education message itself, whenever the parent, even though it's not spanking, giving a punishment to the children, there is a conflict of interest. And also, they talked about the domestic violence, and we see the side opposition views that domestic violence or abuse cases that are irreversible results are given to the child. Maybe the broken legs were permanent mental disease caused by the abuse of the parents. That's not the case of domestic violence. Please, Mr. Speaker, please be rational enough to take care of what is the domestic violence of abuse cases and not. We see that the irreversible harms caused by the parents are the results and objective cases that should be considered in the court. And on the side of opposition, we told you that government role is to make sure that the parents can carry out their rights and responsibility for their children. We see when the government tries to restrict Yes, sir.
So you're saying that unless the parent half kills the child, any kind of violence is allowed?
We say that is not true because we clearly see that just because there is a possibility of abuse, we should not stop the education measure. This is because the government has to ensure the parents' responsibility and rights because they gave the responsibility to take care of the actions of the child, and now they say that their actions should be restricted because it is a violence. We see certain violence should be there in order for the safety and sanctity of the children's safe and attitude towards the society, in order for them to become a better member of society, we say because of its education, because we clearly see a difference between abuse and cases of spanking, we say that the government role here is to ensure that parents with their rights and to take care of the responsibility of their children. Now we see what the future implication is. The side opposition argued about aggressiveness and mental disease. We see in cases of France where the child spanking is allowed, that France is one of the lowest crime rate in the Europe. So proving the statistics does not mean that it goes to aggressiveness. We see.
Ladies and gentlemen, there is a clear difference between pinching a child every time he goes out in the street where cars are going around and beating a child almost to death with a baseball bat, ladies and gentlemen. The first one is called education, in order to give a lesson to the child so that the child will not do the same thing over again. And the second one is called brutal violence, where people lose their emotion and start to go for violence without any reason, ladies and gentlemen. We do believe that the first one is parental spanking that we are going on, ladies and gentlemen. We do believe that the first one, about the education, is what we're really talking about in this motion, ladies and gentlemen. We do believe that the prohibition side today is magnifying onto the other half, ladies and gentlemen, in cases where these parents are actually not having emotion, not actually controlling their own emotions when actually they educate their children, ladies and gentlemen. However, ladies and gentlemen, we do believe that the half that the prohibition side is so worried about is already being dealt by the law code that exists. And if they're to ask that isn't the law code really vague, we say no, because even though violence might be subjective, and even though pain might be subjective, the result from violence and result from pain is absolute, ladies and gentlemen. And the current law code clearly states that if an irreversible harm is caused to children, that is an abuse case, and therefore it is a crime, ladies and gentlemen. We do believe that if the prohibition side is justifying a government to come in to an individual household, and if they justify a government telling to a parent to stop educating your child in a way you want because we think that this is wrong, we do believe that the prohibition is being unjust both to the parents and both to the society, ladies and gentlemen. We do believe, while the prohibition side argued for bodily integrity, ladies and gentlemen, we do believe that there are certain times when bodily integrity is delegated to their parents, and there are certain times when parents actually make the decision, ladies and gentlemen. Wouldn't you be surprised to hear that bodily integrity is also infringed when these parents ground their children, or when these parents actually prevent these children from going out to the street in nighttime, ladies and gentlemen? Is this such a crime that these parents are doing wrong to their children, ladies and gentlemen? Is this such an infringe on the bodily integrity that it should be considered as a crime, ladies and gentlemen? Grounding their children because they did something wrong and preventing their children to go out in the streets after midnight is for protection and it is for education, ladies and gentlemen. And we do believe that there's a distinct line between violence and education that we're really talking about, ladies and gentlemen. We do believe that while their case was only solely based on violence is never justified and the government has the right and the duty to protect its citizens, we do believe that we successfully rebutted both stances, ladies and gentlemen. First of all, violence never should be justified. Now we talked about cases where violence should be justified, and we talked about cases where the child does not even understand languages, and we talked about cases where direct punishment or a direct lesson is needed, ladies and gentlemen. What if a child is holding a knife and is about to stab himself or herself, ladies and gentlemen? Would you sit there and make a conversation for like 10 hours until the kid commits suicide? Or would you pinch him and say stop because you're gonna harm yourself, ladies and gentlemen? We do believe that there are certain times where violence really is needed, ladies and gentlemen. And about the government's rights and the duty to protect its citizens, we have told you that in the society, you should feel safe because we have a law code that is not abstract, but we have a law code that is concrete that protect these citizens, protecting these children from getting into abuse with a clear law code, ladies and gentlemen. We are already dealing with cases where children are harmed, ladies and gentlemen. Do not worry, we're protecting these citizens and we're protecting these children with a concrete law code, ladies and gentlemen. Therefore, we do believe that this parental spanking that we're talking about should be rather considered as education done by warm-hearted parents who really desire their children to become better beings of the society, rather than some violence, cruel violence, or mad hitting that is done by some individual to another, ladies and gentlemen. This is not domestic violence, ladies and gentlemen. This is not household crime, but this is a way of education that is fully censored by the government so that abuse will not occur, ladies and gentlemen. We do believe that we won this debate for these reasons. Thank you.
Now I'd like to welcome the government reply to the podium.
Ladies and gentlemen, that was a very good example about the last reply speaker of opposition about example of crossing the road, ladies and gentlemen. When you see a child crossing the road and you say the parents pinch the child, ladies and gentlemen, without telling them what's wrong, is that a better way than telling the child you did something wrong, never cross the road again like that, which is a better way to educate, ladies and gentlemen. We see a difference between controlling a child and educating a child, ladies and gentlemen. That's why we propose the motion. This House believes that parental spanking of children should be a crime. Now, there were two key questions in today's debate. Firstly being the controlling versus education. Secondly being the right of the government or the limitations of the government. Now, to briefly move on to the first key question that both teams had to answer. Now, the opposition side stated today that parents need to educate their children and spanking is most efficient, ladies and gentlemen. And they mixed the usage of the word controlling and educating, ladies and gentlemen. Exactly this point. Since physical pain often results in the current instant stoppage of an action without knowing why they're hit or the reason why they're hit, the parents get to use violence more and more as a convenient method to control the children, ladies and gentlemen. While control is something significantly and profoundly different from education, ladies and gentlemen. In the long term, children will just be put into a state of violence, current violence, without knowing why, and the government will be a bad, negligent government, just justifying violent cases. Later, what are they going to do in the long term? When children become strong teenagers like us, they can always disobey their parents and will not be able to be controlled by the parents because they weren't properly educated by the parents in the first place, ladies and gentlemen. And their case about abuse and how there's prevention methods about punishment, ladies and gentlemen. That's not called prevention, ladies and gentlemen, because violence is caused by emotion, ladies and gentlemen. This is not called prevention, ladies and gentlemen. This is only something called punishment, ladies and gentlemen. Now, there is a contradiction in team opposition. To make children safe, they hit, ladies and gentlemen. To make children not be hit, they hit the children, ladies and gentlemen. Don't you think that's a bit of a paradox in team opposition today, ladies and gentlemen? To the second key question of today's debate about the right of the government and the limitation. The opposition said the parents are the people who are most responsible, and they pictured parents as beings that came from the sky as angels, ladies and gentlemen. The government, exactly this is the point, that's the problem, ladies and gentlemen. The government totally trusts in the parents to be the angels who cannot be wrong in any case, ladies and gentlemen. They assumed that parents are always the right people, the entity that decides the best things for the children. That is why parents' violence has an arbitrary line, ladies and gentlemen. That's why parents' violence will be justified in the end, ladies and gentlemen. Until the end of the day, the opposition still didn't give us the line of violence between the parents when they do violence for the method of something called education, when they use violence for the method of something called control, ladies and gentlemen. They did not give any clear line between violence and education, ladies and gentlemen. The reason is because the government assumes that the parents know best somehow and they do best without considering their own convenience and their own matters, ladies and gentlemen. Also, they talked about how abusement leads to punishment in the court. And they said there's something called a concrete line, how it's something called irreversible things, ladies and gentlemen. When a bone is broken and a bone sticks back together, ladies and gentlemen, is that irreversible or reversible, ladies and gentlemen? Actually, in the mental state of mind, when there's mental violence being done, in the United States military section, there's currently something being commented upon about giving Purple Hearts to warriors who had mental stress, ladies and gentlemen. Is mentally being harmed forever or irreversible or reversible harm, ladies and gentlemen. There is a clearly arbitrary line of violence that we face today in today's debate. That's why we propose a motion. This House believes that parental spanking of children should be a crime. We could not want domestic violence, and under the stats, again, that children, like any other human beings, deserve and should be free from the fear of domestic violence. Thank you very much. We beg to propose.
Speakers may now cross the floor and shake hands. Thank you for your outstanding effort.